Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris, glad to be back. And I have to tell you, the story we are unpacking today is genuinely one of the most consequential infrastructure breakthroughs I have seen all year so far.
That is a strong claim coming from you, Laura. So let's not bury the lead at all. What exactly did Google Research roll out? And why is half of tech Twitter calling this a Pied Piper moment?
So Google Research formally presented something called TurboQuant at ICLR 2026 in late April. And it is a vector quantization algorithm that compresses the key value cache inside large language models down to roughly 3 bits per coordinate, with effectively zero accuracy loss on long context benchmarks.
Okay, slow down for 1 second, because I am pretty sure half our listeners just heard the phrase key value cache and mentally tuned out. Walk us through what that actually is and why anyone outside an infrastructure team should care about compressing it.
Sure, so when you talk to ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, the model has to remember every single token you and it have already exchanged in the conversation. And that running memory of past tokens is held inside this thing engineers call the key value cache.
Right, so basically it is the model's short-term scratch pad for whatever conversation is currently happening, which I assume gets enormous very quickly as your context window grows past a few thousand tokens.
Exactly. And the numbers here are eye-watering because a single Llama 370 billion parameter request running at 128,000 tokens of context consumes roughly 42 gigabytes of GPU memory just for that scratch pad alone, separate from the model weights themselves.
42 gigabytes for one user's conversation history is genuinely staggering. And that is before you even start counting the model weights, the optimizer state, or any of the other infrastructure overhead also sitting in memory.
Right, and what TurboQuant does is take that same 42 gigabyte cache and shrink it down to roughly 7 gigabytes, which is about a 6 times reduction, all while preserving model output quality on the standard long context benchmark suites.
That sounds suspiciously like the Pied Piper compression algorithm from the Silicon Valley TV show, which is exactly the meme I've been seeing all over my tech feeds, my group chats, and even a few investor newsletters this week.
TechCrunch literally ran a headline calling it the Pied Piper moment, which is hilarious because the show was meant as satire of Silicon Valley hype. And now we apparently have a real version of it shipping out of Google Research.
Okay, I have to ask the obvious skeptical engineering question that any senior staff person would raise immediately, which is where exactly is the catch? Because nothing this dramatic in compression land typically comes for free without trade-offs.
That is exactly the right instinct to lean on, and the catch hides inside how the algorithm itself works, which is a clever 2-stage pipeline that combines 2 complementary mathematical tricks to squeeze the cache without losing information that the model actually relies on.
Walk me through both of those stages, but I want you to pretend you're explaining this to a smart senior product manager, not a graduate student in numerical linear algebra or computational geometry.
The first stage is called polar quant, and the intuition is that instead of storing each high-dimensional vector in standard Cartesian coordinates, you rotate it into polar coordinates and then quantize it inside that polar representation, which turns out to be dramatically more efficient.
So you are essentially changing the language you store the vector in, going from something like latitude and longitude in Cartesian space over to something more like distance and angle in polar space.
That is honestly a perfect analogy, Chris, because the polar form concentrates most of the genuinely useful information into far fewer bits, which means you can throw away the rest without breaking the model's downstream reasoning ability.
And the second stage, which I think you mentioned earlier, is some kind of error correction layer that rides on top of the first stage and cleans up whatever quantization noise PolarQuant left behind.
Right, the second stage is called QJL, which stands for Quantized Johnson-Lindenstrauss. And it is essentially a 1-bit transform that captures the residual quantization error using a random projection matrix derived from a classical theorem in geometry.
Johnson-Lindenstrauss is one of those genuinely fundamental results in geometry that says you can squash high-dimensional points down into much lower dimensional spaces without distorting their pairwise distances by very much at all.
Exactly. And Google Research basically said, let's combine a clever coordinate change with a 1-bit error corrector. And then the math works out to give you 3 bits per coordinate of storage with no measurable quality drop on real benchmarks.
Okay, so let's actually talk about whether the quality really holds up under pressure, because I have seen plenty of compression papers over the years claim zero loss and then completely fall apart on real production workloads.
This is where the long bench numbers get really interesting, Chris, because at 3.5 bits per value, TurboQuant scored a 50.06 on long bench, which is identical to the 16-bit baseline they were comparing against.
That is genuinely a tied score, not a rounding error. And it strongly suggests that compression is not throwing away anything that the model actually uses for long context reasoning, retrieval, or in-context learning.
And even when they pushed it down to a more aggressive 2.5 bits per value, the long bench score only dropped to 49.44, which is barely a measurable difference from the full precision baseline.
That is genuinely wild, Laura, because most of the prior art in KV cache compression starts visibly degrading on quality somewhere around 4 bits per value, never mind dropping all the way down to 2.5.
And there is also an 8 times speedup on attention computation when you run it on H100 GPUs, which means this is not just a memory win, it is also a serious throughput win for inference servers.
That combination is what makes this particular story bigger than a typical research paper, because faster attention plus a smaller cache directly rewrites the unit economics of running a frontier model in production at scale.
Right, and let's put real numbers on that statement, because inference now accounts for roughly 85% of total enterprise AI spend, which is a much bigger pie than most people who have not run a budget realize.
85% is the kind of number that should make every chief financial officer at every AI-heavy company sit up straight, read the rest of the paper, and pull their head of infrastructure into a meeting.
And the deployment math gets even more dramatic when you look at concrete real-world scenarios, because at 32,000 tokens of context, a 70 billion parameter setup goes from serving 2 users at $2,088 per user per month down to serving 11 users at $380 each.
Hold on, that is a roughly 5.5 times improvement in cost per user that you can serve on the same hardware, which is the kind of step change that resets the entire SaaS pricing conversation for any AI feature.
Exactly. And if inference is most of the bill, then a more than 50% cut on inference costs flows almost directly through to operating margin, which is precisely why this paper made financial analysts sit up and pay close attention.
And speaking of analysts paying attention, you mentioned earlier that this paper had a measurable impact on the memory chip market, which is genuinely fascinating coming from a single research paper out of Google.
When the news broke, both Micron and SK Hynix saw their stock prices drop fairly sharply in the trading sessions that followed, because the entire bull case for high bandwidth memory has been assuming models will need ever more of it forever.
That is a remarkable detail, Laura, because we very rarely see a single algorithm wipe billions of dollars off semiconductor valuations within 24 hours of an ArcSiv preprint dropping into an obscure research category.
It really does illustrate just how tightly coupled the entire AI infrastructure stack has become, where a clever software trick at the algorithm layer ripples all the way down to multi-year hardware capital expenditure forecasts.
Now, I want to push back on the hype a little bit here, because there is always a meaningful gap between a research paper that benchmarks well and a production deployment that real engineering teams can actually rely on.
That is a completely fair point to raise, and the honest reality as of early May 2026 is that Google's official TurboQuant implementation has not shipped publicly yet, which is a meaningful caveat for anyone considering production rollout.
So what are the people who are clearly excited about this actually running today? Because I am seeing GitHub repositories popping up everywhere, and engineers on Hacker News claiming they are already in production with it.
There are 2 big community implementations worth knowing about right now, including a project called TurboQuant Plus from a developer who goes by The Tom, which has accumulated more than 6,400 stars on GitHub in just a few weeks.
That is significant grassroots momentum for something that came out of an academic research paper just weeks ago, especially given how skeptical most experienced open source teams usually are about brand new techniques claiming dramatic gains.
There is also a second implementation from a developer named 0x0 that ships hand-tuned Triton kernels and integrates directly with VLLM, which is basically the most widely deployed inference server stack on the open source side today.
But these are non-mainline community builds, which means production teams running mission-critical workloads are probably waiting for Google's official drop before they cut over their billing systems and customer-facing APIs.
Right, so there is this awkward in-between window we are in right now where the algorithm itself is real and the gains look real, but the official tooling for safe production rollout from Google itself is still pending.
Let me ask the bigger strategic question, Laura, because what does this mean for the competitive dynamic between the major frontier labs like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google itself, who all run giant inference fleets?
It is actually a really interesting strategic twist because Google publishing this openly is partly a research prestige play, but it also dramatically narrows whatever cost moat closed source competitors might have been quietly building inside their own private infrastructure.
That tracks really well because if everyone in the world can suddenly serve 6 times more users on the same hardware, the cost advantage of running your own custom infrastructure starts to shrink considerably across the board.
And this lands at exactly the moment when context windows are stretching toward 1 million tokens and beyond, which would have been completely uneconomic to actually serve at scale without something like this sitting inside the inference stack.
Right, the long context arms race basically depends on KV cache breakthroughs to even be commercially viable. Otherwise, even the very best million token frontier models would be far too expensive to actually deploy at any meaningful scale.
So, in some real ways, TurboQuant is the unsexy infrastructure breakthrough that quietly makes all the sexy capability stories like agent autonomy, persistent memory, and long context reasoning economically viable in the actual real world.
That is a great way to frame this story because most of the headlines we cover are about model intelligence, but the real bottleneck is increasingly about whether anyone can actually afford to serve the intelligence we already have today.
And when an algorithm can rewrite the cost curve by more than 50% at the inference layer, that is the kind of news that quietly reshapes everything from startup unit economics to hyperscaler capital expenditure plans.
One thing I want to flag for our listeners is that this also potentially changes the geography of AI deployment, because suddenly running these models at the edge or on premises becomes way more tractable.
That is a really sharp point, Chris, because if you can fit a 70 billion parameter model's working memory into 7 gigabytes instead of 42, you are now in range of high-end consumer hardware and on-premises deployments.
Which has implications for sovereignty, for regulated industries, and for any enterprise that has been holding back from AI adoption because they cannot send their sensitive data to a third-party hyperscaler endpoint.
Exactly. And that is why I think this story is going to keep ripening over the next few months. Because the second-order effects on procurement, deployment patterns, and competitive strategy are still being worked out across the industry.
Final thought from me is that we should probably circle back in a couple of months, once Google's official implementation lands, and we can actually see how it performs in real production workload telemetry across multiple customers.
Agreed, because the proof will be in real workload telemetry. But if even half of these benchmark numbers hold up under sustained production load, this is going to be one of the defining infrastructure stories of all of 2026.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.